Nicolás Maduro, captured on foreign soil, flown into U.S. custody, and suddenly standing in a Manhattan federal courtroom. Did the United States just rewrite the rules about arresting foreign heads of state? Or is this an ordinary criminal prosecution dressed up as a geopolitical thunderclap? Stay with me. By the end of this video, you'll be able to separate what we actually know, what's still speculation, and what legal fights are about to decide whether this becomes a landmark international law precedent. On the 3rd of January 2026, U.S. forces conducted an operation in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolás Maduro and his transfer to the United States. Within days, the Southern District of New York unsealed a superseding indictment charging Maduro and others with narco-terrorism, cocaine importation, conspiracy, and weapons counts. This is a short, source-driven explainer, a clear timeline of facts, a plain English breakdown of the criminal charges, the legal defenses and international law arguments, the immediate geopolitical fallout, and the rumors floating around social media busted. Important disclaimer up front. This is educational only. It summarizes reporting and legal analysis as of the 8th of January 2026 and is not legal advice. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Some commentators call this a law enforcement triumph, others an illegal use of force. Which is it? Let's walk through every piece. Start with the timeline. On the 3rd of January 2026, multiple mainstream outlets reported that U.S. forces carried out a targeted operation inside Venezuela that resulted in the capture of Nicolás Maduro and reportedly his wife. U.S. officials announced Maduro had been taken into U.S. custody and moved out of the country. Within days, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York unsealed a superseding indictment charging him with narco-terrorism and related offenses. Media reported an initial federal court appearance in Manhattan around the 5th of January 2026, where not guilty pleas were entered. Some details remain intentionally sparse in public reporting. Reporters have tracked transfers through facilities like Stewart Air National Guard Base and cited plans to detain Maduro in a Brooklyn federal facility, but precise custody chains and exact detention locations are matters reflected in court dockets and official filings which lawyers will scrutinize. The basic public facts: capture, transfer to U.S. custody, SDNY indictment, initial arraignment are solid. The rest will be revealed in filings and hearings. What does the indictment allege, and what will prosecutors have to prove? The superseding SDNY indictment charges narco-terrorism, conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons offenses, including conspiracy to possess machine guns or destructive devices in furtherance of drug trafficking. For narco-terrorism, prosecutors must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that defendants agreed to participate in a conspiracy to distribute controlled substances and that their conduct was intended to benefit designated terrorist groups or otherwise meet statutory definition of narco-terrorism. For cocaine importation conspiracy, the government must show agreement to import cocaine into the United States. Weapons counts require proof that defendants possessed or conspired to possess prohibited weapons to further the narcotics scheme. Many allegations will rely on international trafficking networks, intercepted communications, cooperating witnesses, and financial tracing. But prosecutors still need admissible, credible evidence that links Maduro personally to these conspiracies, and that is not a trivial evidentiary hurdle. This brings us to the core courtroom fight. Immunity. Under long-standing U.S. and international doctrine, a sitting head of state typically enjoys absolute immunity from criminal prosecution in foreign domestic courts for official acts. Defense teams will almost certainly assert head of state and official act immunity, arguing that Maduro could not be arrested and criminally prosecuted while serving as Venezuela's president. There is nuance. Immunity doctrine distinguishes between official acts and private or criminal acts. If prosecutors frame alleged conduct as private criminal activity, for example, drug trafficking for personal profit, the immunity argument can be narrower. Immunity is personal to the office holder. If Maduro were a former head of state at the time of prosecution, immunity might not apply. U.S. Courts have recognized absolute immunity for sitting heads of state in civil cases and broad immunity principles in some criminal contexts, but criminal prosecution of a foreign sitting leader in U.S. domestic courts is extremely rare and legally unsettled. Expect threshold motions to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction and emergency appeals if the district court asserts jurisdiction. The Noriega precedent from 1989 will be cited by both sides, but is not a perfect analog. If the capture involved a kinetic operation on Venezuelan territory, defense lawyers will challenge the admissibility of evidence obtained through that operation and argue the operation itself violated international law. The main U.S. constitutional tool is the Fourth Amendment, which generally constrains searches and seizures by the U.S. government. But U.S. courts have admitted evidence obtained abroad where exclusion would be inappropriate, and there is no general federal rule automatically excluding evidence merely because foreign law was violated. Courts will weigh domestic evidence, rules against comity, and international concerns. Defense motions likely will include suppression motions alleging the extraction and any evidence seized were products of an illegal use of force, and that introducing such evidence would offend principles of justice and international law. The government will counter that operational lawfulness and necessity can be litigated, and that U.S. rules of criminal procedure permit admission of evidence unless there is a statutory or constitutional bar. Admissibility fights could also implicate classified materials, foreign intelligence sources, and protective orders. If the prosecution relies on intelligence gathered overseas, the Classified Information Procedures Act and related discovery procedures will become pivotal. Expect in-camera proceedings and sidebars behind closed doors. Because cross-border operations involve third-party states and partners, diplomatic channels and executive privilege claims could influence what reaches the public docket. On the international stage, the operation triggered immediate diplomatic reactions. The UN Security Council convened emergency meetings, the Secretary General expressed concerns about instability, and several states condemned the operation as a breach of Venezuela's sovereignty, and the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force. Critics argue the operation violated Venezuela's sovereignty, breached Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and violated customary rules on immunity for sitting heads of state. The U.S. framing has emphasized law enforcement and long-standing indictments. But claiming law enforcement to justify a cross-border forcible capture does not automatically absolve the action from international law scrutiny. International law recognizes narrow exceptions to the use of force prohibition, notably self-defense, and in some readings, consent from the territorial state, but public statements have not clearly invoked a formal international law justification, such as collective self-defense. That ambiguity fuels diplomatic friction. The Noriega comparison will be used on both sides, but international reaction now is more geopolitically polarized. Key U.S. Adversaries condemned the act. U.S. Allies are split, and the Security Council is divided. The capture has already set off geopolitical consequences. Reports indicate governments and financial institutions are identifying and freezing assets tied to Maduro and associates. Some media cite identified or frozen holdings in the hundreds of millions, with one frequently cited figure being over $700 million across jurisdictions, though precise totals and legal bases differ and require verification in each jurisdiction's filings. Expect separate forfeiture proceedings, administrative freezes, and civil suits for asset recovery, each with its own standard of proof. Diplomatic fallout is significant. Venezuela and many allies condemned the operation. Some states called emergency sessions at the UN, and others are weighing sanctions or retaliatory measures. Conversely, some countries and analysts framed the operation as necessary enforcement against transnational narcotics networks.